There is a substance sitting beneath the deserts of northwestern China, beneath the dunes that stretch for hundreds of miles in every direction, beneath terrain so hostile that almost nothing lives there, that engineers are now calling the most important energy material of the 21st century. It is not oil, it is not lithium, it is not uranium in the traditional sense. It is something so ordinary, so ancient, so completely unremarkable to the human eye that most people walk past it every single day without a second thought. It is sand. But not just any sand. A very specific kind of sand, combined with a very specific kind of nuclear fuel, inside a very specific kind of reactor that China has spent 4 decades and billions of dollars perfecting in secret. And what they have now built in the Gobi Desert may be one of the most consequential engineering achievements of the last 100 years. To understand why that claim is not an exaggeration, you have to understand the scale of what is actually being proposed here. A single commercial-scale version of this reactor, according to the engineering projections published by the Chinese Academy of Sciences, could generate enough electricity to power a city of 1 million people continuously for 1,000 years. Not 100 years, 1,000. With no carbon emissions, with no risk of the kind of catastrophic meltdown that destroyed public trust in nuclear power after Chernobyl and Fukushima, and using a fuel that is so abundant in China's western territories that geologists estimate the country is sitting on reserves sufficient to sustain human civilization at current energy consumption levels for 60,000 years. That number is not a typo. The reactor is called the thorium molten salt reactor, and the substance that makes it work, the material that is now being called the fuel of the future, is thorium, a mildly radioactive element that was discovered in 1829, named after the Norse god of thunder, quietly ignored by the global nuclear industry for the better part of a century, and is now the centerpiece of what may be the most ambitious clean energy project in human history. Picture a landscape of almost total desolation. The Gobi Desert in the Gansu province of northwestern China, where temperatures swing from -30 degrees in winter to over 40 degrees in summer. Where the wind strips paint from metal and sand fills every seal and gap in equipment that engineers bring in from the outside. It is exactly the kind of place where you would not expect the future of human civilization to be quietly taking shape. But in September 2021, inside a nondescript facility operated by the Shanghai Institute of Applied Physics, a small team of Chinese scientists achieved something that nuclear engineers around the world had been trying and failing to achieve for more than 60 years. They started up the world's first operational thorium molten salt reactor. It ran. It produced heat. It proved the concept. And when the news reached the international scientific community, the response was not celebration. It was shock. Because almost nobody in the West had believed China was that close. The story of why thorium was abandoned in the first place is one of the most consequential decisions ever made in the history of energy policy. And it was not a decision made on scientific grounds. It was a decision made on military grounds. In the 1950s, when the United States was racing to build a nuclear arsenal, the government needed a specific material to manufacture nuclear weapons: plutonium. And plutonium comes from uranium reactors. Thorium reactors, by contrast, do not naturally produce plutonium in usable quantities. They produce uranium-233, which is theoretically weapons-capable but extraordinarily difficult to weaponize in practice. So when the Atomic Energy Commission sat down in the 1950s and 1960s to decide which reactor technology to back with federal funding and political support, the choice was not made by asking which technology would be safest, or cleanest, or most efficient. The choice was made by asking which technology would be most useful for producing nuclear weapons material. Uranium won. Thorium was sidelined. And the entire global nuclear industry was built around uranium-fueled light water reactors for reasons that had nothing to do with whether they were the best technology for generating electricity. This is where things become interesting, because the engineers who championed thorium in those early years were not wrong about the physics. They were simply outmaneuvered by the political realities of the Cold War. And the physics of thorium is genuinely extraordinary. A thorium molten salt reactor operates on a fundamentally different principle than anything most people think of when they hear the word nuclear. There is no solid fuel rod. There is no pressurized water coolant. There is no risk of the kind of steam explosion or hydrogen fire that caused the disasters at Chernobyl and Fukushima. Instead, the thorium and the coolant are dissolved together into a liquid salt mixture, operating at atmospheric pressure inside a sealed system that has an almost miraculous safety property built into the physics itself. If the reactor gets too hot, the liquid salt expands, the nuclear reaction slows down, and the system cools itself. No operator intervention required. No emergency cooling systems. No backup generators that need to keep running. The reactor is, in the language of nuclear engineers, walk-away safe. You can turn off every pump, evacuate every operator, and the reactor will shut itself down without releasing a single radioactive particle into the environment. But the safety properties are only the beginning. What makes thorium molten salt reactors genuinely different from anything the world has ever built before is the fuel cycle itself. A conventional uranium reactor is astonishingly inefficient. It uses roughly 3 to 5% of the potential energy contained in the uranium fuel before the fuel becomes too degraded to sustain a reaction and has to be removed and stored as high-level radioactive waste. The rest of that energy, 95 to 97% of the potential locked inside the uranium, is simply left behind. Locked inside radioactive material that will remain dangerous for tens of thousands of years. A thorium molten salt reactor, by contrast, can consume virtually all of the available energy in its fuel. Estimates from the International Atomic Energy Agency suggest that thorium reactors could be 60 to 90 times more fuel efficient than conventional uranium reactors. That is not a marginal improvement. That is a fundamental transformation of what nuclear energy is capable of delivering. And then there is the waste question. This is the issue that has haunted nuclear power since the beginning. Where do you put the radioactive material when you are done? Conventional nuclear waste remains dangerous for between 10,000 and 100,000 years, depending on the isotope composition. Entire countries have spent decades and billions of dollars trying to build geological repositories deep underground, where they can isolate the waste from the biosphere for time periods longer than human civilization has existed. Finland is building one. Sweden has one in progress. The United States spent 30 years and over $15 billion trying to build one at Yucca Mountain in Nevada before the project was canceled for political reasons. The waste problem is not solved. It is deferred. Thorium molten salt reactors produce waste that remains dangerous for roughly 300 years. Not 10,000 years. Not 100,000 years. 300 years. Which is a time frame that human institutions can actually plan for, fund, and manage. For decades after thorium was sidelined in the 1950s and 60s, the concept existed mostly in academic papers and the arguments of a small group of nuclear engineers who believed the world had taken the wrong fork in the road. The most famous of these was Alvin Weinberg, the director of Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee, who ran a working molten salt reactor at Oak Ridge from 1965 to 1969. The reactor worked. It demonstrated the physics. It produced continuous power for more than 13,000 hours of operation. And then the Atomic Energy Commission shut it down, defunded further research, and Weinberg himself was eventually fired. in part because he would not stop arguing that molten salt reactors were the safer and more rational choice for civilian nuclear power. The decision to shut down the Oak Ridge program is one of those moments in technological history where you can trace a clear line between a policy choice and a consequence that rippled forward for decades. What changed was China. In 2011, the same year that the Fukushima disaster in Japan triggered a global wave of reactor shutdowns and public fear about nuclear power, the Chinese Academy of Sciences made a decision that went almost completely unnoticed in the Western press. They launched a formal national research program to develop thorium molten salt reactor technology, with a budget that would eventually exceed $3 billion, involving more than 700 scientists and engineers across multiple institutions. The timing was not coincidental. Chinese energy planners looked at the Fukushima disaster and drew the opposite conclusion from most of the world. Instead of retreating from nuclear power, they concluded that the problem was not nuclear power itself. The problem was the specific reactor design that had been inherited from Cold War military priorities. They looked at molten salt reactors, looked at the physics, looked at the safety profile, and decided this was worth a serious national effort. The scale of what China built over the following decade is difficult to fully appreciate without seeing the facility plans. The Shanghai Institute of Applied Physics, which led the program, expanded from a few dozen researchers to an institution employing over 500 full-time scientists and engineers. Construction began on a dedicated research campus in Shanghai and a test facility in the Gobi Desert. Patent filings related to thorium molten salt technology from Chinese institutions went from essentially zero in 2010 to over 700 by 2021, more than any other country in the world by an enormous margin. While the United States, Europe, and most of the rest of the nuclear world continued pouring resources into the existing uranium-based infrastructure, China was quietly building the foundations of a completely different kind of nuclear industry. The September 2021 startup of the test reactor in Gansu province was the proof of concept that everything had been building toward. The reactor is small, a 2-megawatt thermal unit designed not to generate power, but to demonstrate that the technology works at operational scale in a real-world environment outside a laboratory. It is the Wright brothers moment. It is not the transatlantic jet. But what it proved was the thing that decades of engineering work had been aimed at proving, that a thorium molten salt reactor can be built, started up, operated, and controlled in the real world, not just on paper and not just in simulation. Think about it this way. The gap between a 2-megawatt thermal demonstration unit and a commercial power plant is vast. But it is a gap that the nuclear industry knows how to cross. Every reactor technology that exists today began as a test unit that generated a tiny fraction of the power of the commercial plants that followed. The PWR, the pressurized water reactor that powers most of the world's nuclear fleet, started as a prototype submarine reactor. The boiling water reactor began as a small experimental unit at the Argonne National Laboratory in the 1950s. The path from demonstration to deployment is long and expensive and filled with engineering challenges, but it is a path with a known shape. China has now announced the construction of a 373-megawatt commercial demonstration reactor, also in Gansu province, with a target operational date in the 2030s. This is not a research unit. A 373-megawatt reactor is a serious piece of energy infrastructure, comparable in output to a medium-sized coal or gas power plant. If it works at commercial scale, and the Chinese government is betting billions that it will, the next step is a fleet of standardized units that can be manufactured, shipped in modular sections, and installed in remote locations, in deserts, in regions far from major water sources, in developing countries that have never had access to reliable baseload power. using fuel that can be extracted from monazite sands, which happen to be extraordinarily abundant throughout China's western territories. Here is the part that most people do not fully appreciate when they first encounter these numbers. China is estimated to hold roughly 220,000 tons of thorium reserves, which according to the World Nuclear Association makes it the holder of the second or third largest thorium deposits on Earth. But the global reserve picture is even more striking. India holds the largest known deposits, estimated at nearly 1 million tons. Brazil has significant reserves. Australia has substantial quantities. Even the United States has thorium deposits large enough to be geologically meaningful. Thorium is, by any reasonable geological measure, not a scarce resource. It is a common one. It is found in soil and rock and beach sand across enormous portions of the Earth's surface. It has never been mined at scale because there has never been a commercial reason to mine it. The reactors that could use it did not exist. Now they are being built. Let that sink in. The global thorium resource base, if fully utilized in molten salt reactors operating at the fuel efficiencies that the physics predicts, is estimated to contain enough energy to power human civilization at its current total consumption level for somewhere between 20,000 and 100,000 years. Those numbers come from analyses published by the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, the institution that ran the original molten salt reactor program in the 1960s before it was shut down. They are not propaganda figures from a government trying to sell a technology. They are engineering assessments from the institution that knows more about this specific reactor design than almost anyone else on Earth. The implications extend well beyond electricity generation. One of the persistent challenges of modern energy systems is that electricity grids need power that can be turned up and down to match the fluctuating demand of millions of users. Solar panels generate power when the sun shines. Wind turbines generate power when the wind blows. Neither can be switched on during a cold, still night when a city of 10 million people turns up its heating. Nuclear power has traditionally been what grid operators call baseload power, meaning it runs at full output continuously and fills in the gaps that variable renewables cannot fill. A molten salt reactor has an additional advantage here that conventional reactors do not share. The liquid fuel can, in principle, be heated by excess renewable electricity during periods of oversupply, and the stored thermal energy can then be used to generate electricity during periods of undersupply. It is, in effect, a giant thermal battery that happens to also be a nuclear reactor. The combination of properties, load-following capability, walk-away safety, minimal waste, abundant fuel, and high thermal efficiency represents something the electricity system has never had access to before. The geopolitical dimensions of this technology are significant and worth understanding clearly. The existing global nuclear industry is built around a supply chain for uranium fuel that runs through a small number of countries, involves complex enrichment processes, and is subject to international safeguards and treaty regimes that were designed specifically to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons material. Thorium reactors operate with a different fuel cycle that, while not completely weapons irrelevant, does not produce plutonium as a byproduct and requires a significantly different set of concerns from a non-proliferation standpoint. Countries that currently cannot access nuclear power because of the political complexities of the uranium fuel cycle might find thorium molten salt technology more accessible. This could mean clean, reliable baseload power becoming available in parts of South Asia, Africa, and Southeast Asia that currently depend almost entirely on coal and gas for electricity generation. The engineering obstacles that remain are real and should not be minimized. Molten fluoride salts, which are the coolant and fuel carrier in the reactor design China is developing, are extraordinarily corrosive materials. They will attack almost any metal they come into contact with at the temperatures required for reactor operation. Finding materials that can survive decades of continuous exposure to hot fluoride salt while remaining structurally sound is one of the central materials science challenges of the entire program. Chinese researchers have been working on specialized alloys and ceramic coatings for years, and they have made substantial progress. But commercial demonstration at scale will reveal challenges that laboratory conditions do not. The handling and reprocessing of the liquid fuel, which must have some of its components removed and replaced as the reactor operates, is another area where the engineering is complicated in ways that a paper design does not fully capture. And the regulatory frameworks for licensing a commercial thorium molten salt reactor do not exist in most countries because no one has needed them before. What changed in recent years is that the